Hello and welcome to Higher Ed Unpacked. I'm super excited to be joined by Tim Winkler. Tim, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
I'm George Glover, co-founder of Social Garden. Obviously, this is the first episode we're filming. We're both very excited about this kind of new project. We're going to be co-creating Higher Ed Unpacked. It's really going to be all about what's happening across the education industry. We've had a number of conversations, obviously, over the past month around where the gap is in terms of kind of content. And obviously, we're very passionate about kind of the industry, the importance of kind of the education industry. And, now with so much uncertainty, so much kind of change happening, I think a great time for us to be starting this project together. So maybe just for a starting point, Tim, I might just get you to introduce yourself for the people listening, and if you could just tell us a little bit about your story, and then perhaps follow up with what your vision is for the podcast.
Thanks very much, George. Well, I've been in higher education for about 23 years. I'm really passionate about not just where the sector has been, but also where it's going right now. We started Future Campus about 2 years ago after Campus Morning Mail finished its run.
Yeah.
And the point of Future Campus is to be an insider's view on news and analysis, what's going on there. And that's why I was so excited about this podcast, because it's really important to have insights and analysis that you can read in 5 minutes on the tram. But you also need a moment to dive a bit deeper into some issues that are really interesting. And I think one of the opportunities here with this podcast is to actually present information that's going to excite people and take people in different directions than that they had before, rather than just here's some more stuff on pedagogy or whatever.
Yeah, and I think, from my perspective, for those of you who don't know me, I'm the co-founder of a company called Social Garden. We're a performance marketing agency. We've been around for about 12 years. What we do is we really focus on customer journeys where there's a big life decision. So education's a really big part of our business. It's been core to us, over the past decade. And I think, from my perspective, I've spent a lot of time, particularly over the last kind of 18 months, outside of the four walls of Social Garden, talking to industry people, interviewing industry people, and I found it really fascinating learning from people in the industry, and I found it a really awesome outlet to kind of inform people, and also, the curious part of me wanting to kind of just learn more about what's kind of happening across our industry. So for me, I think, this is a really unique time. We're going to talk really shortly about, what the recent result in the election means, but I think in a time where so much is changing around us, not just at a education level, but also at a macro level, I think the opportunity to have conversations with yourself, hopefully be able to add some value along the way, and then to really bring in guests who are, at the forefront of a bunch of different kind of topics across higher ed. So for me, it's really about creating a vehicle for people across the industry to be able to, stay up to date with what's kind of happening, what are some of the topical stuff that's kind of impacting the industry, and sort of how do we and how do our guests kind of see the world and see things evolving.
And from what I've seen so far from our chats introducing this, George, is that you've got a lot to share in terms of what's going on outside the sector. I have been really interested to see how much you know about the sector and what's going on, but there's so much that we as a sector can learn from what's going on in property, what's going in aged care, and then seeing, well, how does that apply to us? So it's I think there's a lot of good questions we can explore.
And I think, what's really interesting about now is when I think about the education market relative to some of the other industries we work across, and you mentioned property, is education often is very considered, it's quite slow moving, things take time to evolve, and that's because there's scale, there's obviously compliance is really important, but just the rate of change we're witnessing at the moment, obviously technology playing a massive role in that. You only have to open your laptop basically anywhere and see something about AI, and that is real. That is affecting everything from learning to how we communicate with students to how students discover and learn about organisations. So, yeah, for me, I think being able to apply to be able to probably call on some of the experiences and opportunities we're seeing in other industries, which I think are going to kind of hit the university sector probably in the next kind of 12 to 18 months.
That's so important because, there's 250,000 people working in higher education in Australia. There's, as you say, every time you look at a news story, there'll be mentions about AI every day. But there's not much talk about, well, how do those 250,000 people use it in their jobs? Yeah. There's plenty of talk about how we use it in curriculum and assessment. But then how do we improve systems? How do we get the student experience better? How do we recruit the next 1 million people that are supposed to come into our sector in the next 25 years? There's so many questions about how technology intersects with humans there that we're not just grappling with yet. And I think that's where I'm really keen to dive in.
Yeah, and you've got kind of two choices really, right? You can kind of live in fear and kind of ignore what's kind of happening around us, or you can really kind of seize the opportunity and look at cool, how can we kind of grab onto this technology to really and harness it? And to your point, how can we kind of leverage it right across the sector, not just in learning, not just in marketing, but operations, compliance, legal, and so many applications for the technology. But also outside of AI, there's also just a ton of stuff happening around automation as well. And I think the two things kind of often get coupled together, whereas I think without artificial intelligence, there's also just a lot happening around kind of automation and how people learn and engage in learning, and then also how people engage with kind of university. So keen to unpack that, and yeah, no doubt we'll have some really interesting guests, not just from kind of the education sector, I should add as well. We'll make sure we're bringing in people from outside the sector to talk about things that are happening at a macro level and are likely to kind of impact the education sector over time.
There's a story that just came into my mind then, George, which sticks with me. I've done quite a lot of market research around Australia, and I was sitting in a group with a focus group in Alice Springs, and there was a girl who said, I don't know which was the last uni that came and visited us because they're all the same. They come in, they come in, they present pictures of smiling students, and then we don't ask questions because we don't want to look stupid in front of our friends, and they go, and then we get the next one come in. And so on the one side, we've got amazing technology in tremendous change.
Yeah.
On the other side, in the domestic space, the user experience, the student experience is not that different. It hasn't changed much. And that's where there's some really exciting space where I think we can make it so much better.
Yeah, totally. It's very homogenous, isn't it? From university to university. And sure, strengths and positioning and what you kind of see on a website might be differentiated, but to your point, for that girl who's sitting there in Alice Springs and kind of their real interface before making this hugely impactful decision, which is going to kind of set the course for their lives, to them it's kind of much of a muchness in terms of they're probably more focused on the course, the degree, the program that they're looking to study than they are the delivery. But we know obviously how different that experience can be from campus to campus. So I totally agree that's sometimes how we see the world from inside the industry is very different to how others kind of see us, so.
Oh, absolutely. And there's got to be a revolution in user-centric marketing. I mean, we've talked about it for 10 years, but when you go out and you sit, and I've met with 10,000 students over the past 10 years, and when you go and see it and see what they're feeling and they're seeing from the product that we're pushing out, it changes year to year, the campaigns, and we have more information than they could ever need, but they don't know where to start. They can't find it. They're embarrassed. We're lacking that human to human connection, and I think technology can do a lot to facilitate that.
And Because obviously, COVID was obviously hugely disruptive in all sectors, but particularly the education sector. I think it was a real, changed the kind of course of the industry, and I think woke a lot of people up to like where there were deficiencies and where we kind of needed to be better as an industry. In your experience with being on the ground, meeting with students, as you said, how do you think perception has changed, particularly over the last few years, in terms of a post-COVID world where obviously study being more blended, a lot of the way people engage and learn has changed. Like, what are some of the things you've seen change in how students are thinking about, studying and organisations?
The most pronounced thing that's happened in that time has really been, yes, return to campus. They're seeking connection. They don't want lectures. They want to do social-based learning. So those sorts of things, but coupled with the rise in the cost of living and price suddenly being a factor in a way that it hasn't been for the last 20 years. And so there is a trend towards a more discerning decision by the student. But then what's informing that? They're still based, on the decisions of their parents or their key influences, parents, teachers, and sometimes career advisors as well, of course. Then you've got the mature age market, which is potentially growing. I mean, it's not growing a lot at the moment, but it has to grow a lot in the next 25 years. And we haven't been well geared to speak to mature age students. So you've got an increasing number of people reconsidering, well, what am I doing with my life? But how do I engage with this institution that's only dealing with 18-year-olds? And then you've got 18-year-olds who remember COVID, therefore want social connection and belonging, but they're still seeing brochures of lectures and sort of being told by their parents that you want to have the old traditional on-campus interface experience. And so we're at this tricky moment, and at the same time, they were trending towards online exams and so on, but now they're being told, brush up your handwriting skills because you're going to be doing that for a few more years yet because we're not ready with any other AI test. So I was talking to my son the other day and I was saying, you'd be glad you're in year 12, you'd be glad. And he's like, that you don't have to have people interpret your writing because he's inherited my terrible handwriting.
You and me both.
And he's like, I think I'm going to have to keep it going for another few years, sadly, because there's nothing else on the horizon, it seems. And the uni's saying more and more, get your handwriting skills ready because we're going back to the old small tables and 3-hour exams with a little paper book, which seems nuts in terms of there are so many great innovations in terms of AI and assessment and quality assessment tools where you can get better outcomes and learn more, but we're still, in many disciplines, still locked into an old structure.
Totally. And again, we spoke earlier about fear and that whole, which is guiding some of those decisions. Obviously, preparation, compliance, there's a whole lot of factors that come into adopting technology when it's so kind of new. But again, similarly, talking to friends whose children are in high school, and this whole dilemma around, where is it appropriate to expose our children to AI and technology, and where is it not appropriate so they kind of develop fundamental skills that perhaps AI is not going to help them to develop. So I mean, this is just going to evolve like crazy over the coming years.
And it's very difficult for institutions like, universities, TAFEs, they're a bit like battleships. They take so long to turn around, and yet the world's changing incredibly rapidly. So, if AI is the torpedo coming at light speed and we're in the battleship, it's a scary moment.
Totally.
It's not necessarily going to sink us.
No, totally.
But we have to work out how to adapt and how to get more agile. And it's really technology and some new conversations about new perspectives, and where are we going with this model of higher education?
And I think that's where it'll be fascinating, bringing in a diverse group of guests to hear how different institutions are thinking about it, different people on the ground, I think, and where perhaps some of the challenges actually are. Because again, it's easy to, and you'd be closer to it in your role with universities, but from the outside looking in, it can be easy to make assumptions around, why are they not moving faster? But as you well know, it's like it does take a lot, and often for very good reason, to actually move and adopt new technology within these institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes for good reason and often for not, to be really honest. Because they describe universities as the world's most imperfect market. I've heard, it's like because of compliance and regulation, and because we're entering an era of greater regulation, there is a fear that inertia and is going to be embedded even more deeply. But we basically have to work against that to make sure there is a sustainable model for the future. So it's a really vital time to be having these conversations, because if we don't, we're going to be stuck in the old inertia model, basically. No one wants to be there.
Yeah, totally. So we've just obviously come off the back of a federal election here in Australia, where education was a very hot topic, obviously talked about at great detail from both sides of the government. Obviously, we've got a result now. It brings hopefully some certainty in terms of moving forward. What are you seeing, or what do you see as some of the key, I guess, takeaways from kind of the change of government, and what do you kind of expect to see, in the next 3 years as a result of the change of government?
There's been a huge sigh of relief. You could almost hear it from across the sector that we are getting continuity in government, that the more draconian caps that the coalition were proposing are not going to come to fruition. The coalition didn't want ATEC, the Australian Tertiary Education Commission, to go ahead. Now it is going ahead. Mm-hmm. That's quite a big deal. It's something that many of the people in the sector will have heard the acronym and know generally that it's going to exist, but it's a really big deal, because basically it's going to be the overall police person or the overall policing mechanism for the system. Yeah. And so how is it going to work with TEXA, that has been the regulator to date, and ASQA, which has been the regulator in the VEC sector? How do they play nicely with each other and interplay? So regulation sounds really boring, but it's actually going to be really critical because they're going to go into price setting, they're going to go into behaviour and being good corporate citizens in terms of paying and that sort of thing. So there'll be a lot of compliance aspects which will be positive for the sector, and others which will be challenging. Mm-hmm. So that's ATEC will be the first thing.
And just on that, what's the timeline on that?
July.
So
So it's coming in. There's not the legislation through yet to put it in place, but they've said there will be an interim group in July, and then move forward to essentially making it more functional next year. So we've got that. Then we've got funding, which is they're talking about introducing new funding models. So the start of next year, a needs-based funding model. So students with disabilities, students from low SES areas, regional areas, and Indigenous students. Those four groups are going to be seen as priority students that get a higher rate of payment per student,
fantastic.
Which is awesome and needed. But again, how will that play out? What will that mean? Will that mean that students allocate more resources towards recruiting those students rather than others, because it'll be a higher value student, or not? But also, what does it mean for student services within the university? How do they actually make good use of that money? So that, because getting them in is one thing, but for me, retention and combating attrition is going to be, it's the new frontier of marketing, really. It's something that marketing has been kept out of traditionally. Yeah. It's been seen as something that's an academic area. Mm-hmm. But because of the importance of engagement and ongoing communication and getting relationships with students, even while they're in, I think marketing has a huge role to play in-house. Yep. So that'll be key. After that, I actually think there is a really interesting opportunity for Jason Clare with governance.
Yeah.
Governance is one of the, it automatically you can hear people switching off their headsets. It's like, please don't go there. But I'll skip over to the good bit. VC salaries have been in the headlines for 12 months at least. VC salaries are set by councils and senates. There's various names, boards. All have a responsibility not just for setting executive salaries, but also for governance of institutions. And they only sort of come under scrutiny, or you only hear from them when something goes terribly, terribly wrong. But otherwise, they have a relatively quiet presence, and they're not always particularly functional. And they're frequently staffed by people who don't have a great deal of experience in the sector. So if I was Jason Clare, I would be thinking, well, I could actually engineer a tremendous change in the sector, working with the states and industry, because the states are going to have power over the legislation of who goes in, by changing some of the makeup of those councils. Because if you get that right at the top, that means you can deal with VC pay. You can start to have some real change in culture, in aspiration, in operation models, and with expertise from a board that understands what's going on.
One of the, obviously, you touched on it right at the top around international students has obviously been a hot topic, the hottest topic probably in the sector over the past 18 months, as soon as, student caps started being discussed. I mean, obviously, the Libs were campaigning for a more aggressive approach and, reducing the student caps and also setting a limit of no more than 25% of the student base being from international students, which obviously would have had a significant impact on, a number of organisations. I mean, there's 8 organisations that sit over that cap, and a couple of them are over 50% of that cap. We've got clarity now in terms of what the numbers, well, to a degree, we've got some clarity. How do you see, how do you see it kind of shifting the focus in terms of, obviously there's going to be more people, more organisations or the universities vying for the same customer, the domestic student, because there's going to be a lot more demand. What do you think is going to kind of need to change in terms of the university's approach to kind of marketing, approach to kind of growth, I guess? Is it more about brand? Is it more about specialisation? Like, what are some of the things that are going to come out of, in particular, the increased focus on kind of the domestic students, do you think?
I think we're actually on the cusp of a new era of marketing and recruitment in universities. So we've gone from a traditional model where you essentially try and engage students individually, have a particular focus on young people, pull them in, job done, and then you've got separate teams doing that internationally and domestically. Now with restrictions on the international teams, in terms of the numbers that they can recruit, and that likely to be in place for another little while. There's an increasing pressure on getting greater outcomes from domestic, and suddenly a realisation that, hey, we're not actually using a whole lot of techniques that we could have used in international in the domestic space. Maybe we could actually share some IP here. That's happening a little bit, but there's going to be a whole new focus on, well, where do we go from here? There's new products, there's new competitors in the market. There's there's your LinkedIn's and your other online academies that are selling competing products, if you like. They're not there yet in terms of competing with an accredited degree, but they're eating away at the edges. And so there needs to be a new look at the model of, well, how do we sell and to whom and what is it? There's been a complete disenfranchisement of most marketing teams in terms of any say in what the product is. That means too often universities are dislocated from what students want. So we see time. I get the call usually when things are going really badly. I go and help where I can and work with institutions where things have been let go too long. And often it's with some market research and some looking at market analysis, you can see, well, what you're selling with this degree here is just people don't want it. So the reason why some slight changes in that, it might be a name even, or it might be changing a few units so it's more suitable for what employers want. But it's that more outward focus of listening to what employers want, what students want, and then getting your product mix and your world right. And it's a completely different marketing ecosystem to what we've had before, which has just been a more retail, let's sell it, get them in the door and
get it off the rack. Like, I mean, that whole positioning and branding point of view, obviously kind of at a macro level when we look at Australia, and I'm sure we'll talk about that soon in terms of how is Australia going to compete across, in a global market, but certainly domestically, the lack of differentiation and the lack of purpose brands kind of that sit within the, within the organisations, that can be really confusing. Again, you come back to your story earlier with the girl in Alice Springs. I mean, in the same way, how do we create more differentiation around, products, the learning experience? I think that is going to be really core and really key, and is probably what's going to help to define kind of the winners and the losers, because inevitably there are going to be winners and there are going to be losers kind of in this new market. I mean, domestic students are declining. We know that. There's life within the postgrad students increasing, but again, like for like, there's a big disparity in terms of total numbers of students. So we are in a highly competitive market where, brand and marketing and positioning and student experience is just going to need to go to a whole nother level.
Absolutely. And it's interesting in that context to also look at, well, what's the role of the tax? So in each state, you've got UAC, VTAC, and so on, QTAC, and so on. There in WA, the unis went their own way with direct applications a lot because had the sense that the TAC wasn't working for them so much. I gather it's sort of come back a little, but the TACs have really tried to evolve to be a centralised sorting house and also do some more of the marketing. Can they do that at a reasonable cost and at scale and actually in a personalised way? It'll be interesting to see where the locus of expertise ends up, because for a large institution like a group of 8 with a $2-3 billion revenue base and a huge marketing budget, they can afford to in-house a lot of that expertise. But most of Australia's universities are much smaller than that and are really trying to work out, well, how do we actually cope and how do we get this new sort of engagement but with a very small cost base, or much smaller cost base. And so there's going to have to be some outsourcing and working with different providers on looking at an experimentation and piloting to see what's really working.
Yeah. And on that topic, we've obviously this consolidation happening at the moment over in Adelaide. You talk about the smaller universities. How do you think that plays out? I mean, do you think we're likely to, if we get the crystal ball out, do you think we're likely to see more of that kind of in this market, or do you think it'll be more about universities kind of right-sizing based on their offering and based on kind of where they want to be really strong and compete?
It's a real challenge right now, because if you were just based on existing sizing, then you would have to say a number of universities would have to merge with others. Based on the Accord, which says we're going to double enrolments in 25 years, then there's more. We have to create more space, double the space in our campuses effectively for students. I think there's got to be some more strategic mergers and some more differentiation at the same time. Some of the mergers might be within higher ed, for example, but others will be between TAFE and higher ed. I think the dual sector model is still well in the minority here, but it's a very strong model for where the Accord says we need to go, where you have a transition right through from a basic TAFE qualification right through to a PhD. And so there's tremendous pathway advantages for any university that hooks up with a TAFE and has that entry point. It creates a whole new space, but also a whole new way to demonstrate you're serving a community.
Yeah, totally.
And so I would see a lot more hookups and formal, not just partnerships, but formal mergers.
I mean, it'll be interesting. I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to speak to both sides of the fence in terms of the universities that have that TAFE element and that pathway all the way through to those that don't, and just understanding the kind of complexities and the opportunities within that. You mentioned the Accord. I mean, to me, it just seems, it seems quite similar to some of the Victorian commentary around housing goals. It seems like a pretty lofty goal. How like you're on the ground talking to institutions. How are they interfacing with government on the Accord and thinking about, geez, we've got this goal that we're this expectation that this is where we're going to be in 25 years. Is that on the agenda right now, or is that just something that is sort of sitting in the back? Like, how do you kind of see that space? Because it fascinates me that we can have this insane, what seems like kind of an insane goal sort of sitting there in the background, and then obviously the institutions needing to find growth and right size and get to kind of this milestone.
I absolutely agree. The institutions are thoroughly on board with the Accord being the government policy for the future.
Yeah.
They are thoroughly on board with the equity approach of the Accord and the intent to make higher education and TAFE accessible to all. But seems a general agreement. There has to be a remarkable transformation to achieve anything like those numbers. Yeah. And a real wait-and-see approach to see, well, what's going to go on with funding? Who's paying? What I want to know is, has anyone actually gone out and asked those million extra students? Did they want to come?
Yeah.
It's like throwing a party and setting out 1 million chairs and then hoping against hope that it's all going to get filled in 25 years. I believe many of those students will want to come to higher education, but many might not. Maybe they'll be happy doing some other role which doesn't require them to go to qualification, or maybe they'll be in a situation where they have to work or have to do or have family caring obligations where they just can't. So there'll be a whole range of personal issues, and again, we're designing the build it and they may come system rather than a user-centric system. And so from a policy point of view, that's something the government's really got to get on top of. They got to
reverse engineering.
Feels
like. And you mentioned that. I mean, again, another topic was obviously the move away from CPI indexation for HECSTED, obviously to now to pinning it to wages, which it really helps. I mean, I think it was something like $3 billion of debt, wiped out as a result when they kind of went back and made the adjustment back to 2023. But I mean, a lot of people, and you mentioned on the ground, I mean, for a lot of people, it's hugely expensive, and we're in an environment where cost of living is the crisis is real. Obviously. You can get it. I know I speak for myself, and my degrees deliver me a huge amount of ROI. But that's probably that decision is being scrutinised far more than it kind of ever has been. So it's going to be fascinating to see the interplay of the Accord and the goal, and then funding, and how much does it cost to study. And I think about an increase in online studying, and how does that work in terms of the costs and fees. So it's going to be really fascinating how the product evolves to kind of meet the growth targets. So I think it's going to have to.
I absolutely agree. And I think this is also, again, where we can take something from the international market, where for a long time it's been more about value than price. And perceived value than price. But at the moment, the domestic market is fixated on the price angle because we're not articulating the value. So the universities and the TAFEs that identify a really strong value proposition, they're going to go gangbusters. But those that keep on relying on, come and get a degree or it'll be nice, it's not enough anymore. So it's the end of the era of relatively lazy marketing and into a value-based, differentiated proposition where you can really say, this is why I'm here, and I'm happy to pay for it.
And it's a nice segue, I suppose, into kind of the international market. So we've got clarity on student caps now. Obviously, it's a much better outcome for the market in terms of where the caps sit as to where they may have sit if the government had a change. How is Australia going to compete? How are you kind of seeing the global international student market, and how is Australia positioned? For the coming kind of term, essentially.
And that's such a great question, George. Because I mean, I think we've got to talk about the coming week as opposed to the coming term. In the Trump 2.0 era, it's constantly changing. But right now, Australia is in a remarkably good position, it would appear. So, but mainly because of the impacts of competitors. So. Just this week, Keir Starmer was saying that Britain doesn't want to become an island of strangers, effectively, and a white paper came out talking about reducing the post-study work rights for postgraduates from 2 years to 18 months, and also other restrictions. So strong signals there that they want to reduce their student numbers. Equally, Canada's demand has gone through the floor, 40% reduction year on year from March to March, and the US, of course, you've got hundreds of millions of dollars being pulled out of Harvard and many other institutions, as well as a lack of DEI programs, as well as just the basic issue of can I get in the door once I knock on and arrive in America, and so. Huge challenge. I mean, at the same time, Trump's talked about green cards for IT students and many other things. So it's very turbulent. But right now, Australia, despite our negative rhetoric about international students, is in a relatively stable position. We've got very high visa prices, visa application prices, 2,000 as opposed, which is almost double that of the UK, I gather. But I think we are in a potentially a solid position. That being said, who knows where the market is at right now. I think there's people like, Rob Lawrence who'll be going out and doing research right as we speak to see, well, what is the market doing? Where is Brand Australia going? And I think that's one of the because the government in the past has invested heavily in Brand Australia. And individual states and cities have done their campaigns. Now, what does that all mean in this environment where it's so much more expensive to invest? They've seen the negative rhetoric. They know it's harder to get in. Who's coming? How do we ensure there's diversity of source market? And then where do we go from there? When I was at Monash, just before I'd started there'd been an issue with a Chinese student in New Zealand, and China essentially turned the tap off students going to New Zealand. And all of a sudden, the Australian market at that time saw that, and this was about 2005, and said, well, source market diversity is a really important thing. So we pursued that in a very rigorous and clear way, certainly while I was at Monash, and we had a cap on the proportion of students from each market, so it wouldn't be flooded with any one nationality, and there would be source market diversity. That sort of slowly ebbed away and disappeared, particularly post-COVID. Now it's time to get back to that and get back to a much more self-disciplined and structured approach.
Cool. Was there any? Obviously, we've talked about a number of, I suppose, the kind of key points and key things that have come out. Anything else that sort of, before we get to kind of wrapping up, is there anything else that sort of really got your ears pricked up at the moment that's happening across the industry, either that came from the election or not, something that you've kind of got a close eye on that you expect to see us talking about, I suppose, in the coming months?
I think I come back to AI. I mean, it's one of those things where we look at what articles are read most frequently in Future Campus, and basically as soon as there's an article on AI, their readership's through the roof. There is a tremendous interest in it. There's some skeptics, there's some, your early adopters, as with all technology. But it's the bit that I'm not seeing come through, and the bit that I really want to pursue with you is looking at, well, what are all the technological applications that we should be considering, not just for marketing, but for that retention bit and delivery and internal systems? Because systems in institutions have been constant downfall. When I've been to various places where if you just chip away at the systems and get rid of the bad forms and make it actually relatively easy to apply, the people just walk in the door. We make it way too hard because we're addicted to sclerotic systems that someone put in once and they're a bit hard to change. Technology has the opportunity to change a whole lot of that. And I'm really interested in your perspectives on how much that is a reality and how much is just a pipe dream.
Yeah, and you know, I think about as well just when you look at when I look at kind of where I think the winners and losers are going to be across, as this technology revolution kind of plays out, and it will be the biggest transformation, far greater than the mobile phone. It'll be the biggest transformation since the internet. I think everyone's pretty agreeable on that now. But I think what the universities in particular have is just this great wealth of first-party information and data. And I think the winners in this kind of new world are going to be the ones who have really strong core assets as it relates to kind of first-party data. And what I mean by that is from a learning point of view, it's all the course content, it's decades and decades of course content of information and how it relates to student outcomes. So I think the opportunity around leveraging that data to deliver a more personalised, better experience for students to get better outcomes, I think is going to be insane. And I think from a technology point of view, to your point around systems and workflows, I mean, just the accessibility and the ability now to kind of create a layer of technology or create layers on top of your data sets and just streamline things. Like, Mike, my business partner, over the weekend, we're working on a new project that's basically leveraging voice AI agents to do certain tasks, whether it's across the customer journey to drive, better customer service for someone who's building a new home, for example. And we were able to basically create, a quasi application that sits on top of our data layer, which is a working prototype within a couple of days, just prompting using a tool called Lovable. So I think the opportunity for people and for marketers sitting within these organizations to kind of just to be able to tap into their creativity and to be able to kind of act as if they were an engineer and building stuff and to your point, making some stuff that should be really simple and really easy to use actually simple and easy to use. And I think, I think we're going to see a lot of change. I think that's where the short-term change is going to come, is just around user experience at the front end in terms of like how prospective students engage, go through the application process. They might be talking to an AI voice agent that's tapped into a university's knowledge base about, a certain course and, all the details and how it's delivered and what a past student experience has been. I can see that working really and happening pretty quickly, whereas I think the more longer term benefits are going to be around that, like actually changing the way people learn and people kind of engage with learning. And, I think about myself, the way I responded to content, like I'm kinetic, I love doing, like I'm learning and that's how I store information. And, the ability now soon for universities and other education institutions to really kind of adapt the model to the individual, I think is awesome. And again, I think it's going to happen faster than people think. I mean, we mentioned competitors to unis. Obviously you've got new academies popping up that are really like tech first, and they're able to kind of plug into just the internet to get information. Now, we know that is very risky and that can be problematic in terms of where that information is sourced from. And there's a lot of conversation at the moment about generative AI content is basically tools like ChatGPT, just referencing other ChatGPT created content and how dangerous and ineffective that kind of is. Whereas I see more the opportunity of being able to plug into, a university's first-party data, first-party information to deliver this really awesome kind of experience. So, yeah, I'm really looking forward to diving into how technology and AI is changing the world, and obviously how it's impacting student recruitment, student experience, and then just a workforce and enablement. And, we were talking about, degrees and how, and like jobs, and how we just need to be doing, there needs to be so much research invested into where the demand's going to be for future jobs, because that's changing radically. And obviously where we point out the students of today, of tomorrow, to focus their energy, and where we invest our workforce of tomorrow in terms of learning is going to be critical to making sure that Australia is built for success and is building a workforce that is going to enable us to be productive and compete on a global stage in the future. So yeah, I'm fascinated to kind of dive into and talk to some of those topics in more detail.
Is it a case with a lot of systems that it's a bit like a house renovation? Do you do the knockdown, or do you do the partial renovation and patching here and there until people are ready for the knockdown?
I think definitely. I think there's some fundamental stuff where, and I think most of these organisations have pretty good data sets now, have a data lake, have a CDP sitting on the data lake. I think that having data infrastructure and really good data infrastructure is what's going to enable people to really compete and deliver great technological outcomes and enable them to tap into AI. So I think that's kind of table stakes. And then to your point, I think it's just going to be adding on bits. It's not once you kind of got that established, then it's going to be about solving problems or capitalizing on opportunities in all different facets of the business. And that's probably going to take, obviously it's going to take a great deal of work on compliance and how people interface with data within, these organizations, but also it's going to require the right skills, the right thinking. It's going to require a lot more collaboration than what I think is happening currently across IT, technology, and kind of the other departments of the university. So yeah, to answer your question, I think it's getting the foundations as table stakes. That's kind of all about data infrastructure, and then it's going to be just building layers on top of that.
How do you end up convincing someone that's going to be not like the experience of sitting on a phone call to your telco, 40 minutes waiting, and then you get some answer that you don't want?
Well, I think the 40 minutes waiting is probably a good place to start, because I think, we're living in a world where we're increasingly impatient. We're used to platforms like Uber and Airbnb and Uber Eats, where we can, at the tap of a button, we can click and get access Amazon Prime, something's on your doorstep in 4 hours. So I think speed and convenience is a huge part of it. The ability for someone to ping a knowledge base and get an answer instantly is going to be hugely beneficial. I think it's going to come down to, I think it's going to take time to build quality. There's still challenges with latency in terms of pauses and it taking a little bit of time. But I think where that's kind of leveraged throughout the student journey, I think is really powerful. I mean, we've been doing quite a lot of tests in across the property sector using AI voice agents to do pre-qualification, to do re-engagement, and we've been playing with how we communicate that it is in fact AI that they're talking to, and not trying to pretend to be a person. And
so how does that work? So do I get a call saying, hello, this is AI here?
Well, yes, it's more like, hey, this is the X Builder experience. My job's to help make sure you've got the information you need. You can ask me any question. It's kind of, there's marketing in terms of the positioning. It's an experience agent. It's, and that's.
I get those calls from humans at the moment. There'd be no more offensive to get it from AI than it would be from a human. So
exactly, and what we're finding is there's certain cohorts that just want to talk and are more than happy to divulge all this information to kind of get to an answer, because sort of the guard actually kind of comes down. So look, I think as it becomes more like voice becomes more mainstream and more common, I think people, like anything, will just adapt to it, and it'll become people will recognize the utility of kind of having information instantly and being to just be able to kind of speed up the process.
Got an instant application for you, which is I think it was last year, possibly. We did a mystery shopping effort, trying to shop for I think it was a postgraduate business degree. Called up, I think about 30. It was every university on the eastern seaboard.
Yeah.
I think one had a answering machine. Everybody else after 5 on a Friday. We still live in a strangely low service environment for sales.
Yeah.
And surely AI is the first step. We don't have to roster the human after 5 necessarily. Surely this is
Totally. And you kind of think about, like I mentioned Amazon Prime before. I mean, I think the level of customer service and customer experience sometimes when you're buying a pair of shoes is better than when you're making this enormous life decision. So yeah, I think absolutely. I think it's where we're probably seeing the application of it more at the moment is more assisting the, let's say, student advisor, call center operator with information, giving them like real-time information when they're on the call to better service the prospective student or the student. But I think, it's moving so quickly now that I think that interjecting an actual voice agent to do certain tasks, again, it's not going to be replacing everything across that student journey, but I think certain things to improve the experience, to better engage with the procedures and get them to the information faster, I think definitely that is going to happen quickly. And again, I come back to my point earlier about data. You can't do that unless you've got great data infrastructure, unless you can actually plug these API services into your database in order for them to kind of interface the information and get it out to the the consumer on the other end. So I think that's still going to be, and again, a lot of work's been done in that area, over the last 10 years, but I still think, most universities would say there's still a lot of opportunity to improve some of those systems, and, that's about compliance as much as it's technology.
Absolutely. So there must be some bold steps and relatively inexpensive steps to just go and dip the toe in because a lot of smaller institutions just struggle with, where on earth do I start? It doesn't sound like I've got the budget for any of that. Yeah. But I'm guessing a lot of the cost of this is going to come down to a quite affordable, and there's going to be a lot of pilot projects.
Totally. Yeah, I think the cost is coming down. I think, as I said, one of the challenges right now within the technology is latency. But and what I mean by that is the rate of the response. It can be a little bit clunky, but absolutely. I think like some of the obvious applications for this, from my perspective, is most universities, particularly if you think SEM1 or peak enrollment times, have all these people sitting in have started an application but haven't completed it. So the ability to basically have an agent to engage those people and say, hey, we noticed you haven't finished your application yet. Is there something I can help you with? How can I kind of help you to get to the next step? So I think around where the job to be done is really just getting someone to a next step, I think is really interesting. I think the other opportunity is often you have universities generating leads, and leads can come from a whole variety of different sources. They can come from people obviously on the ground in high schools where they're collecting information. They can come from websites, from people downloading info packs. Again, you're kind of a step ahead of the application. Your ability, and often what we find with unis and other institutions, is just the sheer volume makes it extremely difficult to be able to speak to all those people. So I think the ability to contact those people and try and guide them on a next step and update the data as a result of the outcome of that call, again, is like relatively lo-fi. It's where it gets probably a bit more challenging at the moment is when you're like going through an application, you've got a whole bunch of potentially, you say you're trying to do an application on the phone, there's obviously a whole bunch of criteria around eligibility. Obviously course advisors have a great deal of wealth on, study areas and individual quals. So I still think to try and do that, just as an AI agent, I think we're not quite there yet, but I think playing roles at different parts of that customer journey is where the opportunity is. And as I said, like not crazy expensive. Like, you're talking, you can set up an AI, a voice agent, you can program it, you could run a pilot for 10 to 20 grand on a relatively large data set to start learning and start getting information going. So, I think it's gonna happen pretty fast.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what I find really interesting about this is that I've always said that good student recruitment in the higher education space is about matchmaking. It's not about selling, because ultimately you're going to lose students at the back end through attrition if they don't like the course once they're in, and then also you'll have bad word of mouth later. So it's about like working out with the students. So, and all these tools are working towards actually doing that better than we could do just on our own.
And like sentiment analysis, right? Where it's like now you've got the ability to use signaling from how they're engaging with an LMS, how they're engaging with email content, other like signals that I'm sure that enter kind of these systems to understand, is someone having a bad experience, and what is their propensity, what's student A's propensity to churn versus student B and C and D, and obviously then to be able to deploy, whether it's a human or whether it's AI, just deploy someone to basically be able to contact that student and say, hey, we've noticed, you haven't been doing X, Y, Z. We're here to help. Have something changed in your then like. That to me is about like, rather than having this kind of spray and pray sort of process and like just sending an SMS to everyone that's basically says the same thing. This is just enabling institutions to be way more targeted, purposeful, and ultimately, as you say, reduce churn and increase retention.
Fantastic, which is good for everybody.
Yeah, totally. Well, look, I think that about wraps it up for us. Certainly enjoyed kind of first conversation. Super excited where we're going to kind of be taking Higher Ed Unpacked. Stay tuned. We're going to have a bunch of announcements around guests. We're going to be trying to get an episode out every couple of weeks or two to 3 weeks. So if you've got any ideas, if you'd love to kind of come and feature on the podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Any feedback, we'd love to hear it. But we hope everyone kind of enjoyed the first episode, and big thank you to you, Tim.
Thank you, George. Awesome. Loving it.
Legend. Cheers, mate.